She put the phone in her mother's coffin to keep in touch, but when it rang the next day, the reality was scarier than any fantasy. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The air in the funeral home was thick with silence, interrupted only by the soft murmurs of grieving relatives and the occasional rustle of clothing as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The scent of fresh flowers mixed with the faint traces of candle wax, creating an atmosphere both solemn and unreal. 6-year-old Aisha sat on one of the wooden benches, her small hands clenched tightly around the fabric of her black dress. Her feet, clad in polished shoes, barely touched the floor. She had never attended a funeral before. The concept of death was something she had only seen in cartoons, where characters always came back after the next scene. But now, as she looked ahead at the open casket surrounded by lilies and roses, the truth settled in her chest like a heavy stone. Her mother was lying inside that box, dressed in her favorite blue dress, her hands resting gently on her stomach. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't going to wake up. Aisha's grip on her dress tightened. She felt the warm, familiar presence of her older brother, Jaden, sitting beside her, his arm lightly touching hers. On her other side, her grandmother held a tissue in one hand, occasionally dabbing at her eyes while murmuring prayers under her breath. People kept approaching the casket, whispering their goodbyes before placing flowers beside the still body. Some wept openly, others simply stood in silence, their heads bowed. She could hear the preacher speaking, his deep voice echoing through the chapel as he talked about her mother's kindness, her strength, her devotion to her family. Aisha barely listened. The words sounded distant, as if coming from behind a closed door. She couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming emptiness that stretched inside her, a hollow space where her mother's voice used to be. When Jaden gently nudged her, she realized it was their turn to say goodbye. She hesitated, her heart pounding, but his steady hand in hers gave her just enough courage to stand. The walk toward the casket felt impossibly long. With each step, the reality of what was happening pressed harder against her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Reaching the edge of the casket, Aisha stared at her mother's face. It looked peaceful, as if she were merely resting, but something was missing. The warmth, the laughter, the soft hum of a lullaby when she was scared at night. The eyes that had always looked at her with love were closed forever. A sharp sting of fear struck her. What if she forgot her mother's voice? What if, one day, she could no longer remember the sound of her laughter? The thought made her panic. She wanted to hold on to something, anything that could keep her mother close. That was when she thought of the phone. Her mother's old phone had been sitting on the nightstand for weeks, untouched since the hospital. It had always been with her, a constant presence in their home. Her mother used to call her on it when she was working late, telling her bedtime stories over the speaker. Aisha remembered falling asleep to the sound of her voice more times than she could count. She reached into the pocket of her dress, feeling the cool, smooth surface of the device. She had taken it that morning when no one was looking, holding on to it as if it were a piece of her mother she could keep. And now, standing before the casket, she knew what she had to do. Her hands trembled as she placed the phone gently beside her mother's hands, tucking it under the folds of the blue dress. No one noticed. Everyone was lost in their own grief, too occupied with their sorrow to see the small gesture of a child trying desperately to hold on. Aisha stepped back, her chest tightening. The casket lid was closed moments later. She hadn't expected the sound it made, the dull, heavy finality of wood meeting wood. The realization struck her with full force. This was it. She would never see her mother again. The thought sent a tremor through her body, and she felt Jaden's arm wrap around her shoulders. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, the kind that made the air feel colder than it actually was. The cemetery was quiet except for the rustling of leaves and the occasional sniffles of the mourners. Aisha stood close to her grandmother, her fingers clutching the fabric of the woman's coat. She watched as the coffin was lowered into the ground, the earth slowly taking her mother away. People took turns tossing flowers and handfuls of dirt onto the casket. Aisha stood frozen, unable to move, unable to make sense of what she was feeling. When Jaden gently placed a single white rose onto the grave, she forced herself to do the same. The petals looked so small against the darkness of the soil. Her mother was gone. Forever. She barely heard the rest of the ceremony. Voices became muffled, faces blurred. She let herself be guided back to the car, feeling detached, as if she were walking in a dream. As they drove away, she turned back for one last look. The grave was surrounded by flowers now, the fresh mound of earth standing as the only proof that someone had been there. Aisha lowered her head, resting her cheek against the cool window glass. The world outside moved on, but inside her, everything had stopped. The house smelled different. It wasn't just the absence of her mother's familiar perfume, the subtle vanilla and jasmine that used to linger in every room. It was something deeper, something that made the air feel colder, emptier. Aisha sat on the couch, her legs curled beneath her, staring at the living room that was now supposed to be home. Her grandmother's house was not small, but it felt cramped, as if the walls were pressing in on her. The furniture was heavier, darker, the shelves filled with old porcelain figurines and framed photographs of people she barely knew. There were no bright pillows on the couch, no scattered crayons and coloring books. Everything was in its place, and that made it worse. Aisha had never spent more than a few days here before. Even when her mother had been sick, she had always gone home to her own bed, her own room, where the walls had posters of cartoons and shelves filled with stuffed animals. Now, all of that was gone, left behind in the apartment they had shared. She hadn't been allowed to go back after the funeral. The adults had taken care of everything, packing away what was necessary, leaving the rest. She didn't want to ask where her toys were. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing felt the same without her mother. The first few days after the funeral passed in a haze. People came and went, bringing food, speaking in hushed voices, glancing at her with pity in their eyes. They asked how she was feeling, but she never answered. She didn't know what to say. She spent most of the time sitting in the corner of the living room, watching the grown-ups talk. They spoke of arrangements, of paperwork, of things she didn't understand. Sometimes her grandmother would sit beside her and stroke her hair, whispering words she barely registered. Jaden tried to distract her, bringing her books, offering to watch cartoons with her. But Aisha didn't want to read, didn't want to watch anything. She wanted everything to stop. The worst part was the nights. Her mother had always tucked her in, smoothing down the blankets, pressing a kiss to her forehead before turning off the light. On the nights when she worked late, she would call, and Aisha would fall asleep to the sound of her voice. Now there were no calls, no soft murmurs telling her that she was loved, that everything would be okay. The first night in her new room, she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the house. The bed was too big, too stiff. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket up to her chin, but sleep wouldn't come. She reached out in the dark, searching for something to hold on to. Her fingers brushed against the nightstand, and she felt the edge of the phone case. It wasn't the phone itself. Her mother's was buried now, lost beneath the earth, but it was something. She clutched it close to her chest, squeezing her eyes shut. The silence was unbearable. The next morning, she barely touched her breakfast. Her grandmother had made pancakes the way her mother used to, but they didn't taste the same. Jaden watched her from across the table, his fork idly poking at his food. He looked tired, the dark circles under his eyes more pronounced. He wasn't sleeping either. Their grandmother sighed as she sat down with her cup of tea. "You have to eat, sweetheart," she said gently. "You need your strength." Aisha didn't respond. She wasn't hungry. After breakfast, she wandered through the house, looking but not seeing. She found herself in the hallway where old photographs lined the walls. Her grandmother as a young woman, her mother as a little girl, then as a teenager, then as an adult, holding baby Aisha in her arms. She stopped in front of that one, staring at the image. Her mother looked so happy, her eyes bright, her smile wide. Aisha reached out and traced the outline of her mother's face with her fingertips. She wanted to remember everything. The sound of her laughter, the warmth of her hugs, the way she used to hum softly when she cooked. But the memories felt like sand slipping through her fingers. In the days that followed, she stayed mostly in her room. She didn't cry, not really. The tears had stopped at some point, replaced by an emptiness she couldn't explain. People said it would get better with time, that she would feel normal again. But Aisha didn't believe them. How could she? Her mother wasn't coming back. One evening, as the sky darkened outside, she heard her grandmother and Jaden talking in the kitchen. She knew they were discussing her, even though their voices were low. "She's barely said a word," her grandmother murmured. "I'm worried about her." "She just needs time," Jaden said. "She's still processing everything." A pause. Then her grandmother sighed. "I don't know if I'm doing this right. I don't know how to help her." Aisha turned away, curling up on the bed. She didn't need help. She just needed her mother. That night, as she lay in the darkness, she wished for something, anything, to make her feel close to her again. And then, just as she was about to drift into uneasy sleep, the phone on her nightstand vibrated. Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up, reaching for it with trembling hands. The screen glowed in the darkness. One word appeared on the display. "Mom." Her heart stopped. The phone buzzed again, the sound filling the silent room. Aisha's fingers hovered over the answer button. She knew it was impossible. She had seen the phone placed in the coffin, had watched as it was buried deep underground. But the call was real. And she had to know. Taking a shaky breath, she pressed the button and lifted the phone to her ear. Silence. Then a soft breath. And a whisper. Her name. Aisha sat frozen, the phone pressed against her ear, her small fingers gripping the edges so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The room around her faded, swallowed by the heavy silence stretching from the other end of the line. She could hear something, soft, distant, like the quietest breath brushing against the receiver. The sound sent a chill down her spine. Then, a voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. Her mother's voice. Aisha. The name came through the speaker like a fragile thread, so quiet that she almost thought she had imagined it. Her breath caught in her throat. Her chest tightened. She wanted to answer, to say something, but her lips wouldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the call ended. The screen of the phone went dark. Aisha stared at it, her heart pounding so loudly that she could hear it in her ears. The silence of the room pressed against her, heavier than ever. Her fingers trembled as she placed the phone back on the nightstand. She lay down slowly, curling up beneath the blanket, her mind spinning. It had to be a mistake. Maybe she had imagined it, half asleep, caught between a dream and reality. Maybe it wasn't real at all, but it had felt real. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to steady her breathing. Sleep did not come easily that night. The next morning, she didn't tell anyone. She sat at the breakfast table, staring at her plate, pushing her food around with her fork while her grandmother asked if she wanted more syrup on her pancakes. Jaden sat across from her, his eyes still filled with quiet concern, but neither of them spoke much. The house was filled with the dull sounds of a radio playing in the background, the clinking of dishes, the occasional footsteps in the hallway. It felt normal, but Aisha knew nothing was normal anymore. All day, she thought about the call. She wanted to check the phone again, to see if there was a missed call, but she was afraid of what she might find, afraid of what she wouldn't. As the sun began to set and shadows stretched across the walls of the house, she retreated to her room. She sat on the bed, the phone resting beside her on the nightstand, her eyes flickering to it every few minutes. She didn't know what she was waiting for. And then, just as the clock on the wall struck 9, the phone vibrated. Aisha flinched, her breath catching in her throat. The screen lit up, and there it was again. Mom. She didn't move. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap. The phone buzzed again. She had to answer. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she finally swiped her thumb across it, bringing the phone to her ear with a shaky hand. Silence. Not just the absence of sound, but a deep, unsettling quiet that made her skin prickle. Then, just as before, a soft breath. Then the voice. Aisha. It was her mother's voice, but it wasn't the same as before. It sounded weaker, distant, as though coming from a place far away, barely reaching her. Her throat felt dry. She tried to swallow, tried to force herself to speak, but no words came out. The line crackled faintly. Then, just like the night before, the call ended. Aisha sat in the darkness, the phone still pressed against her ear long after the screen had gone black. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't her imagination. She didn't know how. She didn't know why, but her mother had called her, and she was afraid. The next day, she couldn't sit still. Every noise in the house made her jump. Every ring of the phone sent her heart into her throat. She avoided Jaden's eyes. She didn't want to talk. She wanted answers. That night, she didn't wait for the phone to ring. She sat on the bed, phone in her hands, staring at the screen, waiting. Her fingers hovered over the call history, but when she finally checked, there was nothing there. No missed calls, no record of her mother's number, but she knew it had happened. At exactly 9 o'clock, the phone buzzed. This time she answered immediately. Mom? The word left her lips in a whisper before she could stop herself. Another pause. A long silence that stretched so thick she almost thought the call had already ended. And then, Aisha, where are you? Aisha's breath hitched. The voice was quiet, weak but clear. Her mother's voice. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell her she was here, wanted to ask where she was, but before she could say anything, the call cut off. A sharp beep. Silence. The room felt colder. Aisha pulled her knees up to her chest, hugging them tightly. She didn't understand what was happening. All she knew was that her mother was gone. But somehow, she was still calling. Aisha barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the voice again, soft, distant, calling her name. It lingered in her mind like an echo, a whisper from a place she couldn't reach. The silence of the house felt heavier than ever, pressing down on her as she lay curled up under the blankets staring into the darkness. She wanted to believe it wasn't real, that it was some kind of mistake, but she had heard it too clearly. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't just her imagination playing tricks on her. Her mother had called her, and the words she had spoken, "Where are you?" unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. By the time morning arrived, the exhaustion weighed down on her, her body sluggish as she climbed out of bed and padded down the hall toward the kitchen. The house smelled of coffee and warm toast, the familiar scents mingling with the distant hum of the television playing in the background. Her grandmother sat at the table, stirring her tea, while Jaden leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. Neither of them noticed the way Aisha hesitated in the doorway. She sat at the table without a word, staring at the untouched plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her. Her grandmother glanced up, her gaze soft with concern. "You hardly ate yesterday, sweetheart," she said gently. "Try to eat a little." Aisha picked up her fork but didn't lift it to her mouth. The food looked the same as always, but she had no appetite. "She had another bad night," Jaden murmured. His eyes met hers briefly, studying her face. Aisha quickly looked away. She knew she must have looked tired. She had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close her eyes, waiting for the phone to ring again. But it hadn't. For the first time in 3 nights, there had been no call. She wasn't sure if that made her feel relieved or disappointed. Her grandmother sighed, reaching across the table to brush Aisha's curls away from her face. "Maybe I should call your teacher. Tell her you'll stay home another week." "I don't want to go back," Aisha murmured. It was the first thing she had said all morning. "I know, baby," her grandmother said softly, "but staying in the house all day isn't good for you either." Aisha didn't respond. She knew they meant well, but nothing felt normal anymore. Not school, not home, not anything. She didn't know how to explain it, how to put into words the way everything felt wrong, and she definitely couldn't tell them about the calls. She knew what they would say, that it wasn't possible, that it was just her grief playing tricks on her. They would look at her with the same worried expressions, whisper to each other when they thought she wasn't listening. She didn't want them to think she was losing her mind, so she said nothing. The day passed slowly. She stayed in her room, flipping through books she didn't really read, letting cartoons play on the television without paying attention. Jaden came in once, sitting at the edge of her bed and asking if she wanted to go outside with him for a while. She shook her head. He didn't push. Night came faster than she expected. She sat on the bed, her legs crossed, the phone resting on the nightstand beside her. She didn't touch it. She only watched it, waiting. 9 o'clock came and went. No call. She should have felt relieved. Instead, her stomach twisted with unease. Had it stopped? Was it over? Had she imagined everything? Maybe the exhaustion was finally catching up with her, because the weight of it suddenly pressed down on her limbs, her eyelids growing heavy. She lay back against the pillows, still watching the phone, her body sinking into the mattress. She was almost asleep when the screen lit up. The soft vibration filled the quiet room. Her breath caught. She reached for the phone with trembling hands, her fingers hovering over the screen. The name was there again. Mom. Aisha pressed the answer button. This time, there was no hesitation. She brought the phone to her ear, her heart pounding. Silence. The kind of silence that felt thick, almost suffocating. She held her breath, listening, waiting. Then, Aisha. Her chest tightened. It was her mother. She knew that voice better than any sound in the world. A pause, and then the same question as before. "Where are you?" Aisha's fingers tightened around the phone. Something about the way her mother said it sent a cold shiver down her spine. She wanted to speak, wanted to answer, but she couldn't. Before she could gather the courage to say anything, the call ended. A dull beep echoed in her ear. She stared at the phone, her breathing unsteady. This wasn't grief. It wasn't just some trick of her mind. Her mother was calling her, and she didn't know why. Aisha awoke to the dim morning light filtering through her curtains. She blinked slowly, feeling the lingering weight of sleep pressing against her limbs, but her mind was already racing. Last night's call hadn't been a dream. It had happened, just like all the others. And just like before, her mother had asked the same question. "Where are you?" The words clung to her thoughts, looping over and over as she sat up in bed. She knew them by heart now, could still hear the way they had been spoken, soft, uncertain, as if her mother were truly searching for her. But how could that be? Her mother was gone, buried beneath the earth. Yet the phone had rung, the phone that was supposed to be in her grave. Aisha pulled the blankets tighter around herself, pressing her back against the headboard. A quiet dread settled in her stomach, twisting in a way she couldn't ignore. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't know if she wanted to understand. For the first time, the calls didn't just make her sad. They scared her. She forced herself out of bed, padding toward the bathroom in slow, hesitant steps. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. Her dark eyes looked hollow, her face thinner than she remembered. The weight of everything was beginning to show. When she came downstairs, the scent of coffee and buttered toast filled the kitchen, but it did little to stir her appetite. Her grandmother stood at the counter, carefully spreading jam onto a piece of toast, while Jaden sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up as Aisha hesitated in the doorway. "You okay?" Aisha nodded. It was a lie, but she didn't know what else to say. Jaden didn't press. He just tilted his head toward the seat across from him, a silent invitation to sit. Aisha did, folding her hands in her lap as her grandmother turned and placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of her. "Try to eat, baby," her grandmother said softly. Aisha nodded again, though she had no intention of touching the food. Jaden went back to scrolling on his phone, but his fingers slowed as he frowned at something on the screen. After a moment, he sighed and set the phone down. "I was looking up something last night," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes flickered toward Aisha in a way that made her stomach tighten. "About phone numbers. You know how when people pass away, their phone numbers eventually get reassigned?" Aisha's fingers clenched in her lap. "So, maybe someone else has Mom's number now," Jaden continued. "Maybe whoever has it doesn't even realize, and they're just, I don't know, accidentally calling?" Aisha stared down at her plate, willing herself to keep her expression neutral. She wanted to believe that explanation. It would have made sense. It would have been easier. But she knew it wasn't true. No one else could have called her like that. No one else could have spoken in her mother's voice. She swallowed against a lump forming in her throat. Jaden watched her for a moment before sighing, running a hand over his face. "Look, I know things have been weird, but you can talk to me, okay? If something's bothering you." Aisha wanted to tell him. She really did, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just nodded. Jaden didn't push, but she could tell he wasn't convinced. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Aisha barely remembered going through the motions, answering her grandmother's questions with quiet hums, nodding when necessary, pretending to listen. She knew they were worried about her. She just didn't know how to let them help when she didn't even understand what was happening herself. By the time evening arrived, her stomach was in knots. She had a feeling that the phone would ring again. The thought sent a shiver through her, but she needed to be ready. So when the clock struck 9 and the vibration hummed through her nightstand, she was already waiting. She picked up the phone with steady hands, pressing it to her ear before she could second-guess herself. Silence, then the breath. Soft, distant, then the voice. "Aisha." Her fingers tightened around the phone. "Where are you?" Her pulse pounded against her ribs. She had to say something. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Another pause. The line crackled faintly. Then, "I don't know where I am." Aisha's breath caught. This was different. The calls had always been the same words, the same question. But this time, her mother's voice sounded almost confused. It sent a chill down her spine. Before she could respond, the call cut off. A dull beep, then nothing. Aisha lowered the phone slowly, staring at the screen. The question burned in her mind. What did she mean? How could she not know where she was? Her heart pounded as she stared at the darkness beyond her window, her thoughts racing. She needed to find out the truth, and she needed to do it soon. Aisha didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind tangled in thoughts she couldn't untangle. The calls had changed. The pattern had broken. Her mother's voice, once repetitive and distant, had taken on something new. Uncertainty. "I don't know where I am." The words burrowed into her chest, leaving an ache she didn't know how to soothe. It felt like her mother was truly lost, reaching out for something, for someone. But how could that be? The dead didn't get lost. They didn't speak. They didn't call their daughters in the middle of the night. And yet, the phone had rung. Her mother had spoken. Aisha turned onto her side, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Her grandmother's house was silent, the kind of silence that felt deep, pressing, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. She should tell someone. She should tell Jaden. But what would she say? That their dead mother was calling her? That every night, at exactly the same time, her voice came through the speaker, quiet and searching? He wouldn't believe her. He would say it was a dream, a trick of her grieving mind. Aisha squeezed her eyes shut. She wasn't imagining this. She knew what she had heard. The next day passed in a blur. Her grandmother asked if she wanted to go for a walk, if she wanted to visit the park, or go to the store to pick out a treat. Aisha shook her head at every suggestion. Jaden tried too. He knocked on her bedroom door in the afternoon, holding a deck of cards. "Remember when Mom taught us how to play spades?" he asked. "We could play around, just the two of us." Aisha wanted to say yes. She wanted to sit across from him and pretend, just for a little while, that things were normal, that their mother wasn't gone, that the phone calls weren't happening. But she couldn't. So she shook her head. Jaden sighed, but he didn't push. He never did. "Okay," he said, setting the cards down on her nightstand anyway. "In case you change your mind." She didn't. When evening fell, she sat on her bed, watching the phone. The house was quiet again, except for the distant sound of the television downstairs. She could hear her grandmother's soft voice speaking to someone on the phone. Aisha didn't move. She waited. At exactly 9 o'clock, the phone vibrated. Her breath caught. She reached for it, pressing it to her ear as soon as she answered. Silence. Then the breath. Soft. Faint. Then the voice. Aisha. Her name. Spoken the same way it had always been. Then a pause. Then, I'm scared. Aisha's fingers dug into the phone. Her mother sounded different. More than just lost, she sounded afraid. Aisha swallowed hard, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The line crackled faintly, a hesitation. Then, I don't know how to get out. The words sent a chill down her spine. The call ended. Aisha pulled the phone away, staring at the darkened screen. Her mother was calling her, not just calling, reaching out, but from where? From what? Aisha didn't know, but she needed to find out. Aisha barely noticed the passing of time after that night. The world around her became distant, blurred, as if she were watching it from behind a glass pane. She went through the motions of the day, answering when spoken to, eating just enough to stop her grandmother from worrying. But inside, she felt like she was unraveling. The calls had changed everything. Her mother wasn't just calling anymore. She was trapped. I don't know how to get out. The words had echoed in Aisha's mind since the moment the line had gone dead, replaying like a song stuck on repeat, over and over, until the meaning behind them became unbearable. She had thought, at first, that her mother's voice had been nothing more than a cruel trick of grief, a voice from the past clinging to her, refusing to let go. But now she wasn't so sure. Now it felt like something more, like a plea for help. She wanted to tell Jaden. She wanted to tell someone. But what would she say? She had no proof, no call history, no recordings, just a dead woman's voice whispering through the speaker of a phone that should have been buried beneath the earth. No one would believe her. And so she stayed silent. That night, she didn't wait in bed. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside the nightstand, the phone resting in front of her. The screen was dark, the room dimly lit by the glow of the street lamp outside. She watched the clock. 9 o'clock. The vibration startled her, even though she had been expecting it. She grabbed the phone with both hands, hesitating just for a moment before answering. Silence, the breath, then Aisha. Her name, softer than before, then, I'm so tired. Aisha's heart clenched. She had never heard her mother sound like this, not even in the hospital, when the sickness had taken its worst turn, when exhaustion had weighed down her every word. This was different. This was final. The static crackled, stretching the silence between them. Aisha's fingers tightened around the phone. She had to say something. She couldn't keep sitting there, listening, frozen. She swallowed, her voice barely more than a whisper. Mom? A pause, then the voice again. I have to go now. Aisha's chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. Go where? But there was no answer, a pause, a shift, the quietest inhale, then, I love you, baby. The line went dead. Aisha lowered the phone slowly, her hands trembling. The words rang in her ears, sinking deep into the hollow ache inside her. That was it. The last call. She knew somehow with the certainty that she couldn't explain that it wouldn't happen again. She stared at the screen, waiting for the vibration that wouldn't come. Her mother was gone, truly gone. And for the first time since the funeral, Aisha let herself cry, not in quiet, hidden sobs pressed into her pillow, not in the small, broken tears that slipped down her cheeks when no one was looking. She cried fully, openly, the way she had been afraid to, because this time she understood. This time she was ready to say goodbye. The house felt different after that night, not in a way that anyone else would notice. Aisha's grandmother still cooked breakfast every morning. Jaden still sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, and the television still hummed softly in the background. But to Aisha, everything had shifted. For the first time since the funeral, there was no waiting. No watching the clock as the minutes ticked toward 9. No lying awake, dreading the sound of the phone vibrating in the darkness. The silence that had once felt suffocating now felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from the air around her. She still thought about the calls, about the voice on the other end of the line, about the way her mother's last words had settled in her chest, warm and aching all at once. "I love you, baby." Aisha carried those words with her. She didn't tell Jaden or her grandmother about what had happened. The secret felt too fragile, too personal, as if speaking it aloud would make it fade. Maybe, one day, she would find the right words to explain it. But for now, she kept it to herself, letting it rest in the quiet spaces of her mind, in the part of her heart where her mother still lived. Days passed, then weeks. The world kept moving. Aisha started going back to school. The first morning, she hesitated in the doorway, clutching the strap of her backpack so tightly that her fingers ached. She hadn't been inside the classroom since before the funeral, and the thought of stepping back into that space, of sitting at her desk and pretending that things were the same made her stomach twist. But Jaden stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You don't have to do everything at once," he said. "Just take it one step at a time." One step. That was all she needed. She walked inside. At first, things were strange. People looked at her with quiet sympathy, their voices softer when they spoke to her, their smiles careful. She didn't like it, but she understood. They didn't know what to say, and she didn't blame them. She still didn't know what to say either, but slowly the days became easier. She started answering when people talked to her, started raising her hand in class again, started sitting with her friends at lunch, listening to their stories, letting herself laugh even when it felt unfamiliar. Some nights, when the house was quiet and she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she still reached for the phone. Not because she expected it to ring, but because holding it in her hands made her feel closer to something she didn't want to lose. She didn't need the calls anymore, but she still held on to the memory of them, to the moments that had let her hear her mother's voice one last time. One evening, Jaden knocked on her bedroom door, a deck of cards in his hand. "Wanna play?" Aisha hesitated for only a second before nodding. She sat across from him at the small wooden desk, the cards spread between them. The familiar shuffle, the click of plastic edges against the table, it all felt like something from another lifetime. Jaden dealt the cards, glancing at her as he set the deck down. "Mom was terrible at this game, you know," he said. Aisha smiled, the memory coming easily. "She always tried to cheat." Jaden grinned. "And she was awful at it." Aisha let out a small laugh, and for the first time in a long time it didn't feel forced. The game began, and as the cards moved between them, something inside her settled. Her mother was gone. But she wasn't lost. She was here, in the stories they shared, in the warmth of the laughter that filled the room, in the love that remained. And Aisha knew, with quiet certainty, that she would always be with her. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next videos. Feel free to share this video with your friends and family. And if you're looking for more stories like this, check out our other videos. See you next time.